Okay, Sublation Media viewers, all of you Sublators out there. It is I, Douglas Lain.
And it is I, Ashley Frawley, sweating buckets, but not dropping F-bombs this week, as I apparently did last week, Doug has
Yeah,
informed me. So it
yeah,
will be PG-13 today, I promise.
yeah. It looks like no one's watching at the moment. I wonder if we've got some error in our in the way we're going out there. But let's assume that there people are in the chat and the people are watching. Let's see. Well, actually, I tell you what. Oh yeah, here we go. Someone says
Okay.
boring. So yeah, there's someone
Okay.
there.
Yeah, it's all good. We're here. Okay. So
Okay.
obviously today, everyone wants to know. Look,
Yeah, about the UFOs.
I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's
But it's
aliens.
aliens. Yeah. So before we get to the primary topic, I want to announce that we'll be in New York City. We're going to be in New York at Columbia University on the 18th and 19th. It's a conference. It's an event. It is something to put down on your calendar if you're in New York City or if you want to travel to New York City. On the 18th, Sohrab Ahmari and Chris Cutrone will be discussing their books Tyranny Incorporated and The Death of the Millennial Left for the first hour, and then we'll have a panel discussion on the topic of the future of dissent and the prospects for political change. Then on the 19th, Chris Cutrone in the same room at Columbia University, and that will be listed in the description of this video. Chris Cutrone will discuss his book, The Death of the Millennial Left, and there will be a panel on the prospects for a reconstituted left. So we are looking forward to being in New York City. Here's this. August 18th, 5 to 7. On the 19th, 3 to 5 at Columbia University, Chris Cutrone in New York City. We are excited to be going, and we hope to see you there. So what's going on in the chat? Anything? Oh, yeah, no, people are just chatting away. So all YouTube is YouTube Kids now. Let me see if I've done something I'll see if I can fix this. Let's see here.
Perhaps wait. So while Doug delves
No,
into
no, it's
whether
not.
or not
I've
it's
got it.
on YouTube Kids.
I know it's not. It's not. All right. Go ahead.
Well, so what we wanted to talk about was what Doug has been following on the edge of his seat for weeks and weeks and weeks, months even. No, not the Twitter files, but the possibility of life that the US government is aware of and has been keeping away from us. I can't really imagine that. Honestly, I feel like the US government is pretty transparent about everything. And so, I think it's totally fine. I think everything is exactly as it appears, and maybe we'll just never know. What do you think, Doug?
I have a whole bunch of talking points on this subject, and I want to point out that I've been interested in the topic of UFOs since the early 90s, probably even before then. Actually, definitely before then, even as a child. However, over the years, I did eventually come to what I consider to be a mature position on the topic, which is that we basically cannot know what's really going on with UFOs, and should assume that there are none until there's hard evidence that there's been no conclusive evidence presented in any of the books or magazines or eyewitness accounts so far, and I would stick by that. So at the moment, I try to be agnostic on the topic and leaning towards skeptical. However, I watched the UAP hearing, or some of it, this last week, and I was struck by how official it seemed and how the reporting on UFOs seemed to be taking on a different character or tenor. And here are some things that I think we can say with confidence. I'm going to go through a few of these things, and I'll let you jump in because I have a whole bunch of points, but let me just go through a couple. The U.S. government has photographic evidence of UFOs that it cannot explain, and that pilots claim that violate the known laws of physics. However, it is possible the pilots were capturing images that just amounted to optical illusions, or they were misperceiving events. However, On the other hand, former Director of National Intelligence Radcliffe has stated that there are many sightings that involve multiple sensors, including satellite imagery. And I want to run a quick clip from this Fox interview to demonstrate.
Well, I know people always want to start with alien life forms and extraterrestrial life. I don't think the report's going to address that. It's not going to rule anything out or anything in, for that matter. I think what's important and what people can expect about this UAP report is I think it'll talk about the number of sightings. They're far greater than have been publicly disclosed before. I think there's been some leaking that there may be as many as 100. I'm not going to dispute that number. But what's more important, Trey, is that the number of sightings and recordings that have been picked up by what we call multiple sensors, that is visual, radar, ISR, satellite. And when you have multiple sensors under conditions where we see UAPs, it explains away a lot of the things like visual disturbances or things like that. And so, I hope the report will address why we can't answer some of these explanations, because here's the bottom line. When it comes to national security, ego can't be involved. If there's something out there that's bigger or faster and stronger, we've really got to answer that question. And so having a discussion about it is going to be a good thing.
So what I would conclude from all of that is that the government is stating yet again that there are objects in the skies, sometimes underwater, that they can't identify and that defy what they would expect to see in terms of their expectations of movement, that seem to defy the laws of physics. And so we can say that with, I think, confidence that the government claims that there are objects in the skies that are unidentified and that are unusual.
Yeah, so this is what is undisputed, that there have been, I think the official number is 650 reports that are confirmed as unconfirmed. That is, that for which they have no explanation. And now those who are, intelligence officials and United States government officials are saying, the closest that they come to sort of any kind of affirmation is simply that. And also that they should be taken seriously, in that if they are enemy drones, we need to know what they are. We need to know whether or not, we have serious threats to, or you in the United States have serious threats to national security. And so, it's not something that you can just sort of hand wave away. At any level, it is considered to be something quite significant. Now, we have it's very difficult to talk about this because obviously we, in science, you can only draw conclusions on the basis of what is known, and you cannot infer the existence of things that are not yet known. And so the most likely explanation will be the simplest one, which is that these are, some of the sightings were, some sightings were confirmed to be things like airliners, things that have been confirmed, not the 650 confirmed as unconfirmed, but some of the things were, perfectly explainable phenomena. And so it could be that it's just this sort of thing, even President Jimmy Carter, several years after leaving the White House, disclosed that he thought that he saw what was then called a UFO, and it turned out to be Venus. And everyone always jokes about that, right? Like, how could you possibly think or confuse Venus for a UFO?
The true mystery with Jimmy Carter is not his UFO sighting, but the fact that he was attacked by a killer rabbit while canoeing. And the rabbit had big teeth like this and came at him. But the thing is, this fact that there are many reports of objects that cannot be confirmed one way or another dates back to at least 1968, the original Project Blue Book report the Air Force released then said the same thing, that they made it, they went through all the different reports, they figured out what many of the different objects were, but there was a subcategory of sightings that could not be explained. And that's where they left it in 1968. And it would be easy to leave it there now, I think. Right?
Mm-hmm. But to give some sort of background and context, now last week on the 26th of July, there was a hearing, and you sort of briefly alluded to this, but we should probably explain to those who have not been following it. At the House Oversight Subcommittee on National Security, the Border and Foreign Affairs, seemed to be taking the matter fairly seriously by holding a day-long meeting, multiple witnesses, and of course, one of those witnesses was the Air Force Major David Grush. And so Grush in 2019 was asked to lead a government task force on UAP sightings, UAP being, again, for people who are way outside of this, unidentified aerial phenomena. Oh, my camera just shifted. And it's an interesting, just that name change is interesting in and of itself, because it gives this kind of, it inches it towards something that could be respectable to debate, to take seriously, because UFOs are tarnished by, I don't know, decades of National Enquirer, right? And of course, there's an added specificity there in that we don't know if they're objects, but they are some sort of aerial phenomenon or phenomena that we don't know what they are. Okay, so he in 2019, Grush was asked to lead a government task force on this, and in 2020, of course, the Pentagon released videos of 3 Navy sightings, which they confirmed were UAPs that they did not have an explanation for. And now, at this hearing last week, witnesses testified that the U.S. government has known about presumably intelligent life, non-human activity, since the 1930s.
This is Grush or Grush or whatever you want to say his name, who testified this way. Can I just jump in with one? He said that he had evidence from 40 different intelligence and military officials that a reverse engineering program working on crashed and retrieved UFO craft exists, and that the U.S. government has preserved bodies from these UFOs that are non-human or of non-human origin or non-Earth origin.
And presumably he doesn't mean chickens.
Right.
He's alluding to the fact that there's something extraterrestrial about these, and he even said that some of these contained, quote, dead pilots.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the big headline claims. The other one was, did you say this, that there was a reverse engineering program, that they had found these? Yeah.
Now, we should point out, he has not made any of his documented evidence public.
Yes,
He's
that
been
was the next thing I was
from
going to
making
say.
his evidence available to the congressional committee that oversaw the UAP hearing on July 26th. So they were talking about during the committee and beforehand about getting something called a skiff, which is a secure room where they could go in and like remove all the cameras and phones and everything, and they could brief them on the classified information. And the Pentagon blocked the congressional hearings ability to obtain a skiff. And as far as I know, he has not given his evidence, including the list of 40 intelligence and military officials that could testify to the Congress as of yet.
And then he also claimed that he faced retaliation, but he was a bit vague about exactly what retaliation that was. And of course, it's important to note that he himself has not actually seen any of this. It's all been passed to him, and he's been blocked from having access to any of the programs that he has been informed exist.
Right. Now, he's already made his evidence available to the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, the Thomas Monheim, and to the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I think if he's been briefing them, I think those briefings would be available through FOIA. So if people wanted to try to get a hold of them, they could that way. They'd probably take a long time to get and would be heavily redacted, but it would be possible to get a hold of some information that way. The journalist Leslie Keane, who originally reported on this story, has said she does not know who the 40 individuals Grush relied upon for his story, who they are. And while she has spoken to some intelligence officials who support Grush's story, and they may be amongst Grush's 40, she says the people that she spoke to were not ready to come forward, and that most of the people that Grush is referring to in the 40 might fear retaliation or not want to come forward yet.
So there are a couple of things, a few angles that you could try to understand this from. So the one that we've already said is basically the only sane one, which is that we don't know. We cannot start sort of talking about aliens because this relies on an explanatory model that uses something that we cannot prove exists. So we can't say, oh, well, it's aliens and oh, no, the government's doing such and such. But what we do know exists is countries developing weapons and advanced forms of technology for surveillance. So it doesn't mean like if you see UAPs, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're like it's a spacecraft, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a spacecraft that is manned. It could be a drone. It could be sophisticated, quick kind of viewing technologies or other kinds of surveillance. So it could be that. And then of course, if you really want to go down the path of what is still acceptable and does not require the existence of aliens, we also know that the United States runs a very sophisticated intelligence and information control. I don't know how to put it, sort of projects, let's say. And they're very, very good at giving people information for particular purposes. And so if you wanted to hide the development of new technologies, particularly weapons, then it makes perfect sense and would be highly intelligent to hide this behind a curtain that only crazy people look behind. Right. And so if one of the claims that Grush made was that the United States has alien spacecraft so big you need a warehouse around it or something like that, which made me think, like, good God, what enormous weapon is the United States building that requires an entire warehouse to conceal it? But it's like, yeah, it's aliens. And anybody who wants it to look into it must be crazy because they're looking for evidence of aliens. So that's just me. That's my slightly acceptable tinfoil hat, if that makes sense. So, it could be something like that, just trying to deflect attention from very advanced and large-scale weapons manufacture or building or development, hiding behind a shroud of absurdity.
Yeah, that's possible. But just kind of taking things at face value for a moment, like, or at least continuing to examine like what Grush is claiming. He's claiming, like you said, that this UFO retrieval program and reverse engineering program has taken place or has been around since the 30s. And one of the historic accounts that he verified or appeared to draw us to reconsider in any case is the Roswell UFO story from 1947. And this is a story that's considered to be debunked. In 1994, the Air Force released a document entitled The Roswell Report, Case Closed. And Grush described the report in his News Nation interview. He said, that analysis they did was a total hack job. Anybody with analytic skills can deduce that they're conflating multiple situations. Crash test dummies and movable dunes, for example. They just said that the townsfolk who personally witnessed the Roswell incident were imagining things. They concocted that whole report in an effort to disinform. That was what Grush said about the Air Force's report, the Roswell report, case closed. I took a look at that report over the weekend, and it's not so clear to me that the Air Force's report is merely an attempt at disinformation. Here's some of the things that were in the report, however. The UFO reported to have crashed was actually a high-altitude air balloon, according to the Air Force. The alien bodies reported to have been retrieved were probably anthropomorphic test dummies carried aloft by the U.S. Air Force high-altitude balloons. The unusual military behavior reported by the locals was only a high-altitude research balloon crash and recovery operation, and the reports of bodies stored at Roswell Airfield were most likely a combination of two incidents. And here's where it gets interesting. They say that the incidents that were combined in people's imaginations was one in 1956, 9 years after the date usually given to the Roswell incident, a 1956 KC-97 aircraft incident in which 11 Air Force members lost their lives, and a 1959 manned balloon mishap in which 2 Air Force pilots were injured. So now the report spends a lot of time addressing an eyewitness account that was reported in a 1994 book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. And the Air Force cites the book in its report and also provides a transcript of an interview with the key witness, which was W. Glenn Dennis, who was worked in a mortuary. He was a mortician, a young mortician at the time in 1947. And what I found was that interview is actually available on YouTube, and I'm going to run a clip with this mortician talking about his experiences around Roswell and what he says was 1947 and what the Air Force says was actually 1959. Here we go.
How would she describe her head and her hands?
Well, she said the head, and then the little drawings that I had, the way she explained it and the way she drew it, that the heads were somewhat larger than a human heads. The hands were long, no thumbs. It was just the long, very delicate fingers at the end of on the underside at the tip of each fingers was a pad-like, maybe a little pad, but it looked like the skin had maybe a little suction, like the little suction cups on those. On the, no fingernails on the hands. The head, the lips were just a long, narrow, more or less, not full lips like we would have in most of our people, but very fine lined, very fine lips. There was no teeth. That was the inside of the mouth. It was kind of like a real, a gums. Maybe it was. She said, explain it. It was almost as hard as if it was rawhide, maybe.
All right. So, his story is interesting. And what he's describing there is not his firsthand account of what the alien bodies looked like, but rather his memory of how a nurse he knew at the Air Force Base described what she had seen. She also drew pictures of the alien bodies for him. He tells a story that, if you kind of encapsulate the whole story, he says that he got a call around the time that the day after, or the day of the supposed UFO crash, from the Air Force Base, asking how he, as a mortician, would preserve small desiccated bodies that had been exposed to the elements, and asking him what the smallest caskets that he had on hand were and what their size were. And he described.
They're going to give them a Christian burial or something? What the fuck did he
No,
caskets
they
for?
want
I
to use the
swore.
caskets
Darn
to
it, it's PG-13.
They wanted to preserve the bodies. And he's like, they're asking him, like, how would you preserve the bodies? What would you do? What kind of caskets do you have on hand? And so he describes that. And then he describes taking an injured airman to the Air Force Base, I think the next day, somebody who had, a broken nose and had somehow injured himself. And he'd driven him there in an ambulance and gone into the Air Force Base hospital with him for whatever reason. And it was there that he encountered a red-haired captain and a black sergeant and this nurse. So the red-haired captain and the black sergeant, and the red hair and the ethnicity of the sergeant are important. Basically told him he better get the hell out of there. They didn't want to hear get any trouble from him. He better keep his mouth shut about what he's seen, that kind of thing. And the nurse, who actually encountered him first, was scared and said, "Oh, what are you doing here? You're going to get in trouble." She saw him the next day, and that's when she told him what she'd seen, that there were these alien bodies in one of the surgical rooms, that there was a terrible smell and that around them, and that this is what they look like. You heard him describe that. And the Air Force report says that a couple of things. One is that the Air Force wasn't desegregated in 1947, so it was unlikely that a black sergeant and a white captain would have both been together in the Air Force hospital to bother him. That the red-haired captain didn't start working at that Air Force base or at the hospital until 1960. No, until 1950. That in any case, well after, and that he would have been around in 1959 when there was this incident with a high altitude air balloon where a couple of people got injured. That there was no nurse that fit that description around in 1947. There was no one with the name that this witness gave there, but there was someone that they thought might have been who he was referring to around in 1959. So there, and all this testimony was given in 1990. This interview was well after the fact, right? So here's what I think. Given the fantastic nature of the Roswell incident and the limits that obtained with human memory, the epistemic problems that emerge as you try to remember things that happened many, many years ago, I think we have to entertain the notion that, in fact, he was conflating events, and that his memory was,
at the very least,
and that his memory was colored by the mythology that had emerged around Roswell, and that not that he was being dishonest, but that his memory was not reliable, and that doesn't seem to me to be far-fetched, and I would give the Air Force that claim. And so when Grush says that anybody with any critical thinking ability would see that this was an attempt at disinformation, this report, I think he's being unfair. I mean, if he has good evidence that there is that Roswell was true and that there's a reverse engineering program and all of that, then I guess I can see why he would have the confirmation bias to think that others shouldn't be fooled by this report. But if you don't presume that the Air Force is lying, it's plausible that the eyewitness testimony around this is unreliable, I think.
Well, yeah, and of course, like with so much time passing, it's not just that people don't remember things, it's that it becomes a cultural phenomenon in the meantime, which then influences what you remember and so on. Right.
But yeah, it's fascinating to look at, because you have all these people who seem very sincere. I mean, this guy, what was his name, William Dennis, or the mortician, he's not out there trying to gain anything, apparently, from giving the testimony. He doesn't appear to be insincere in the interview. He seems like a very kind of regular fella who's trying to recall what he saw. And, so I wouldn't want to vilify him or belittle him or think that he had nefarious aims, but just human memory is unreliable, and the way that we know things is always questionable. We should.
Well, yeah, of course. And that, and I mean, just the sheer amount of time that's passed in between is just makes it, and everything that's happened culturally and so on, just makes it so much more questionable. But there was, here's the interesting thing. So we sort of danced around. We did a previous episode about this where we were a little bit reluctant to kind of go whole hog and kind of, say like, oh, what if it is, let's just let ourselves play with it. And, there was a very interesting article that came out in Unheard today by Oliver Bateman called "The Arrogance of Dismissing Aliens." And he makes a lot of really interesting points that kind of got me thinking, because he starts out the article with the same observation that we made when we did the first when this sort of first went into the news and we started talking about it, which was everybody was sort of joking And anybody who covered it did it in a really joking way. And if they did try to take it seriously, there was always sort of a good cop, bad cop kind of thing going. So there was, but in, I don't know, good clown, serious person. So there was the one person who was kind of like joking, hey, what would happen if we took this seriously? I'm a Star Trek fan. And the other person was like, no, and they could do a little banter. And that kind of kept this, allowed the story to be covered and kept it within the Overton window. Because obviously you're not going to start talking about reptilians on the evening news.
You're talking about The Hill with Brianna Joy.
That was The Hill, but that was The Hill. But I saw that happen over and over and over again, which is why I mentioned it. Every single time that it was reported in the mainstream news, it was reported in a jokey way. And in that very similar kind of way, where if they tried to kind of take it seriously, it was, one person was like, no, and the other person jokingly took it seriously. So that's how they tended to do it, or they both just like made a joke about Star Trek and moved on. So it was very sort of non-serious kind of lighter news moment. And he mentions this as well, where he says like internet commentators were sort of memeing it. And even I noticed this too at the beginning of the hearing, like one of the sort of opening lines was, this is the most interesting hearing you're going to see all week. They were just, treating it in a very kind of jokey way. And he says, well, maybe we should take it seriously. He writes, for most online commentators, meanwhile, this congressional hearing is simply entertainment. Even if either camp thinks it's proper that the U.S. government is looking for evidence of extraterrestrial life, neither seems inclined to ask, what if they find it? Those who ask, are there aliens, rarely seem to ask, so what if there are aliens? And he goes on to kind of say the only people who really take and he says the same point. He makes the same point that I did, which is that you obviously can't, we have our culture has certain limits to discussion. Oh, I'm still here. Just my camera overheated because it is very, very hot where I am. Anyways, there are certain limits to discussion. Our
Obviously, there are limits. Clearly, you're no longer on screen.
No, the CIA got me. I was about to reveal the truth, and that's the end of me. No, there are limits to what we can talk about in the cultural sphere. Our epistemic kind of, our plausibility structures are quite clear. You can't, entertain anything for which there isn't scientific evidence. A long time ago, one of my favorite books when I was a teenager was by this, I think he was a psychologist, Ian Stevenson, who went around collecting stories of children who seemed to remember past lives. And he had a couple of cases that were very interesting. And he tried to be very scientific about it. So he was very careful in investigating cases for which there was no prior contact, or he was at least searching for some stories in which there was no prior contact between the child and the family of the person that they claimed to be in a previous life. But it was pretty amazing. I mean, he came up with what do you call it? Pictures. Like autopsy, he would match autopsy reports of the person that they claimed to be, or the details of whose life matched the very detailed stories that these children were telling. And they seemed to have birthmarks that matched the violent injuries that the people had. So it was all it was all very interesting, very convincing. One little girl even remembered parts of her phone number. And she was off by like one digit. But here's the interesting thing. Because he was a scientist, he could not say that what was happening here was evidence of a past life. Because we don't have any that requires that you postulate the existence of a soul that somehow moves into another body. All of these things, these are too many jumps and leaps that simply can't be made.
Right.
And this is the same thing for us. We can want, maybe, like I want to have a conversation about, well, what if it is? I'm not saying it's aliens, but maybe. But
what if it's aliens? Yeah.
Yeah, but you can't, because this requires postulating something that this is something that just doesn't exist.
I think that postulating alien civilizations on other planets requires fewer leaps than postulating reincarnation and soul migration and that kind of thing. But I do see there's a correlation there between the two problems. Here's what's interesting to me about this moment is that it hasn't really changed for a long time. In other words, like since 1968 with the Project Blue Book report, and all of the serious scholarship on the topic of UFOs has basically held the same stance. So that's like someone like Dr. Alan Hynek, who is a ufologist, or Jacques Vallée, who's a ufologist. They will claim that there is a phenomenon, that there is some sort of, there are reported sightings, there are radar sightings, there is multi-sensor, evidence, satellite imagery of unidentified flying objects or unidentified aerial phenomenon. And then they will try to speculate about what possible, what the source of those sightings might be. There's a book, I think, called Beyond Reality or something like that, which is a conversation between Alan Hynek and Jacques Vallée, which I purchased in 1991 at a used bookstore and still have. And they spend the last chapter just going through one thesis after another as to what might explain the phenomenon, and also beating themselves up along the way for wasting time in that endeavor when there's no way to empirically test anything that they're saying. And so they end up talking about sociology and human psychology, and what I'd say is that we're at the same exact point now as we were in 1968 in terms of what we can conclusively say we know. But we have this one particular whistleblower witness who claims to have evidence that would substantiate the phenomenon more thoroughly. Not that it would explain where they're from exactly, but just that it would give us a lot more physical and empirical evidence about what the phenomenon is. So if there are crashed craft that people have been putting their hands on and trying to figure out for decades and decades, that wouldn't solve the question. It would not answer the question is, where do these craft come from and who is behind them? But it would certainly give us more information and help a scientific inquiry to try to get at the answer to that. And certainly also, if it turns out not only is there a crashed disk retrieval program and attempt at reverse engineering, but also there has been contact between the biological entities that are in the craft and the U.S. government, and treaties have been signed and all that kind of thing. Well, then now we're well on our way to one of those movies that we've seen so many times before, right? Like Independence Day, or I don't know, Men in Black is probably the closest movie that we're now living within. But so Grush, David Grush, is really an important figure in this moment. He moves the story beyond where it's been since 1968 into this other realm. But his information, he says, is classified. He has been blocked by the Pentagon from presenting that information. And I worry that we're going to be left with the situation not moving forward because we're going to be kept from being able to examine all the supposed evidence that he says he has. I think the most likely thing is that someone said in comments on another video that all this is about Mormonism and the religious fervor that is secreted away in the federal government.
Oh my gosh.
That might be, that's a good explanation. You have people who believe all sorts of crazy things, and this guy Grush may be easily led astray by people with religious convictions that they dress up as scientific evidence, right? But we should be able to know that. Go ahead.
Yeah, but there's people think like, oh wow, this person had government clearance, et cetera, et cetera. Like, like you think the people who work in various levels of government are all like, I don't know, movie style military types who are straight edge. Like there's just as many loonies as there's anywhere else. So you're gonna have a few people who are nutty and who and probably like any institution, rumors float around, particularly among people with lower levels of clearance and so on. And I'm sure, if you were a bit loony and you heard these kinds of rumors, you might kind of start to put two and two together, and then not also have the shame of coming forward with so little to go on. Because you are just a bit out there. That's also a perfectly plausible explanation. But I think too, you there's so much in what you said that that I think is important. And one of these things was that we wind up kind of having these discussions about sociology or psychology, and that's one of the arguments that Bateman puts forward. And it's true, our narratives of aliens do tell us a lot about our own society, but at the same time, you kind of want to take it further than that, and you want to take the risk that Bateman says only theologians seem to want to take in asking, well, what if there are aliens? And when you said, oh, maybe they're like signing treaties and so on, I think one of the saddest aspects of my allowing myself to think what if was like, well, nothing, because obviously nothing has changed. If the US government has been in contact with aliens, that is, like,
it wouldn't probably be just the US government either, by the way.
Yeah,
similar stories and all the other,
in some meaningful contact with aliens, well, then they're obviously not like harbingers of some great future, because we're still in the same fucking terrible present of like warfare and so on. And also like in the sort of the craziest claims that have come forward, where they're like sharing technology and stuff. What are we using technology for? What's driving a lot of our technological advancement at the moment, and has been for many, many decades, is military. Right. So like aliens are sharing information with us, all the better for us to kill each other. Great. Like nothing changes then. They're not all that different from us then after all, were they?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think we could, I guess what I'm tempted to do when I try to consider the possibility that these aliens are real is I am tempted not to try to leap to like, what would it be like to be an alien, or what can I imagine might exist on another planet, but rather, what evidence do we have? What kind of human evidence do we have that would indicate the nature of these aliens from within our own understanding? I just, it's impossible to know what it's like to be a bat. It's impossible to know what it's like to be a gray alien. But we can say some things about how, at least the stories that we've been told about alien contact, and let's say starting with Grush. I mean, one of the things that Grush is claiming is that there's been a long-standing relationship between some extraterrestrial life form, or maybe multiple life forms, and the people of Earth through their governments, for roughly around 100 years. Well, one thing I think we can conclude from that is that the terms of the relationship have been at least partly set by the states, by the governments of Earth, rather than by the extraterrestrials. The extraterrestrials' motivations are still obscure, but one thing we can say some things negatively, like they're not here to conquer the Earth, and they're not here to try to change our society, even in some other ways. There was a suggestion in this book I mentioned earlier, but where Hynek and Vali discussed the matter. They said one thing they might be doing is a long-term influence campaign on humanity to try to redirect us. And so we could try to figure out, like, what are they subliminally trying to say and do, and how are they trying to influence us when they appear to us in these different guises.
I mean, that's the most optimistic. That's the most optimistic thing. But like, I highly doubt that. There was a comment here. I mean, it's kind of silly even to say I highly doubt that, because we're not in that realm at the moment. But someone said, if there are aliens and they made it to us, they would be a class 1 civilization. I don't think they would share tech with us for war. Exactly. Which is why when people start making claims that like governments are in contact and they're doing negotiations with them, I just think, no, I find that highly implausible. And deeply fucking disappointing if that's the case. Because you would think if you manage to get to a point where you've mastered some kind of faster than light, not faster, or at least as fast as, well, faster if we're talking LQVR drive and all that, but like as fast as the speed of light travel, then you would think they would have solved these kinds of problems and they wouldn't come to, you think they would have greater things to worry about than our petty wars with each other. We would seem like children. It would be like, you would hope that they would find us like an island in Lord of the Flies, and it would be like the adults in the room. But that would mean that was not the case. So either that's highly implausible or just incredibly disappointing that you could get to that kind of level of civilization and still be like negotiating for weapons.
Someone says, isn't it funny how UFOs became big around the 1950s, decolonization anxieties much? I think that's myopic. The story of UFOs, according to Grush, goes back further than that. The first accounting was from a pilot in Mount Rainier. The first contemporary story about flying saucers, where the term flying saucers was coined, happened in 1947, around the time of Roswell, and it was a pilot whose name escapes me at the moment, who saw discs. No, he didn't see discs. He saw cigar-shaped craft skipping across the sky, the horizon, like saucers skipping across the surface of a lake, like flying saucers, he said. I think that I do think we have to grant the fact that there is a phenomenon, that there are unidentified flying objects that have been encountered.
Yeah, of course. That's not debatable. That's even the government says that.
So how we interpret them, what we think these unidentified objects are, how we bring them into our culture and understand them, that might have something to do with decolonization. It might have something to do with fear of the nuclear bomb. Certainly that's pretty obvious, because you can see in the 50s all these science fiction stories about alien invaders and mutant, and even more often like atomic mutants that emerge to destroy cities, like gigantic ants and gigantic bunnies even. But when it comes to the actual phenomenon, it exists. Like we have to accept from multiple sensors, multiple accounts, something unidentified exists in the sky. Something we don't understand has been encountered. That that doesn't mean that it's not just a product of our own misperception. But if it is, then that tells us something about how we perceive things that we should try to understand. And if it is something objective, then, it would, I think, mean that we should try to understand the scientific facts around these phenomena as best we can. And so that makes me like a true blue committed UFO freak, because that is the position of ufologists starting back in the 50s that we need to investigate this.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's even the position taken by, what was it on Fox News? Somebody went on and said, well, Fox News, John Ratcliffe, U.S. intelligence chief during the Trump administration, anyway. He didn't go into any detail about whether or not the allegations, Grush, I've been saying his name wrong, Grush's allegations were correct, because he said there were national security restrictions and all that. But he said the government knows more than they're letting on, and called for greater transparency. I mean, that's just the very edge of what you can sort of sanely say, that there is something going on and it should be investigated. And even that was in the hearings. It was that there are 650 things that we confirmed UAPs that just have no explanation. And we should look into this, because it could be, as I said, drone warfare. Now, I don't want to there was something that I wanted to go back to, in that my analogy, I know, my analogy with past lives is it wasn't a very good one. The only point that I was trying to make is that we can't then it's very difficult to have a conversation about like, oh, what if it's aliens? Because you have to then say that requires that we say something is traveling faster than the speed of light or as fast as the speed of light. Like, how did they find us? Our first kind of radio signal was sent out in 1895. You know, if the government supposedly knows about these things since 1935 at least, you know, that's not enough time, or at least the area from which they can come is very, very close. So it requires that we postulate something's traveling very, very fast, has mastered that kind of technology, and so on and so on. But I recognize that there is a lot more. It's still within the realm of like possibility, much more than, say, the existence of a soul appears to. And so it's not the exact same thing. And as it happens, I do think that life on other planets is highly likely. Highly likely. I mean, it was not that long ago that we thought that exoplanets probably existed, but we weren't sure. And now we know that almost every star has some kind of planetary system. And it's, you know, and it's the amount of stars, the amount of planets is just absolutely unfathomable. And so it's highly likely that there is some kind of life, and even possibly intelligent life, in the span of you know, history that has ever existed in the universe. You know, it's likely. But of course, like, that's pretty much as far as you can go to kind of bridge that extreme likelihood that there's life somewhere and that it's here. While I actually think it's plausible, it's not like in the realm of what we can say reasonably at the moment. That's all I wanted to say with that. The other thing too
can I address something in the chat real quick, or do you want? Yeah. Do I need to? Okay.
No, go.
Someone says, "Well, Lain is a U.S. Westerner. They love that UFO crap," and I want to say, like, that's like, in any other context, if you weren't, you know, labeling me as a Westerner, that would just be clear xenophobia and racist. And backwards. And the fact is that there have been UFO sightings all around the world, in Africa, in China recently. Apparently, according to Bloomberg, the social media sites in China lit up as reports came in that the PLA had shot down a UFO. The accounts of flying saucers are not at all limited to the United States. I know there's been something floating around on social media where it makes it look like that, but that is not the case. Certainly, if you take a long view and read the literature on flying saucers, a lot of the big cases are in places like Brazil. And you know what you'll hear from Westerners when there's an account of flying saucers and some people seeing discs in the sky in Brazil or some other nation. So, well, you know, the Brazilians they love that stuff. They're superstitious people. You know, so you know, that's just not a good explanation when we have some validity. You know, when we have some valid, documented evidence, photographic evidence, both from satellites and the at least reported satellite imagery, and also definite video imagery and radar imagery and pilot witness accounts of these unexplained phenomena. So
never mind just seeing stuff in the sky. There's the whole, like, in Zimbabwe, the aerial school sighting from 1994 where like 64 kids, something like that. Anyway, 62 kids saw some sort of extraterrestrial dressed in black walk up to them and telepathically communicate a environmental, some kind of message. There's so much more. And if you really want to fall down rabbit holes, there are some great experience stories if you want to get into it. I was actually going to read you some. Maybe I'll read you some in the parrot room. But I wanted to make, while we're still sane and talking to the sane world, I wanted to make one more kind of sociological point, like sort of taking the point that it's annoying that we kind of wind up having this discussion about psychology and sociology and so on. But you know what else is really annoying and says something about our sociology is that whenever we have these kinds of movies, and again, Bateman kind of makes this point as well, but I'll extend it a little bit. Whenever we have these kinds of movies where we imagine sort of alien invasion and this sort of thing, it is like a pathway into the purpose of these movies is to like delve deep into the human soul, right? And it becomes this sort of, political commentary discussion. And we never seem to challenge ourselves to imagine what that future world might be like, in which humanity comes to terms with living with with another sort of intelligent species. I mean, there are a few examples of this, but like it's a bit like, so over the weekend I went and I saw J.J. Charlesworth speak on Dune. And this sort of theme in science fiction literature about projecting medievalism onto the future. So you have this like far future kind of space universe and for some reason they're living in feudalism. And it's like, not only are we not imagining a future in which we solve problems, we're imagining in which we still have problems that we actually have solved. And it might be just because, well, humanity's never really got over capitalism, so it's really difficult to imagine us doing that. And we have got over feudalism, so we can tell an epic story about fighting against kings and queens and so on. Whereas, overcoming capitalism is a little bit ambiguous. Now, the obvious counterpoint to that is Star Trek. But even Star Trek is like so far into the future. It's like the medieval stuff is we imagine that the problems that we have now or have had in the past that we've got over, we still have them. Whereas in Star Trek, we imagine that all the problems have disappeared and humanity just lives in this playground. And what I want is a prequel to Star Trek, not that's gritty and explores the human soul and all this stuff. I want us to have the courage, for humanity to have the courage through its art forms to imagine how did the Star Trek universe, how did the people in that universe overcome capitalism? How did they get to that point where the universe is our playground? Why can't we imagine that? And it would make a great story, right? You'd have
how they did it, Ashley?
Yes.
It's in the Star Trek expanded universe. It's part of it's canon. The way,
great. I want to know.
The Earth overcame capitalism was through alien contact. The Vulcans visited Earth when a guy named Cochrane invented the warp drive and welcomed Earth into the Universal or Galactic Federation. And Earth was transformed from a warring backwards planet into a forward-looking civilization.
So we get medievalism, space playground, or Deus Ex Machina. Why can't we imagine humanity doing
it's just Spock. It's not even, he's not a god. He's just another, humanoid with the warp drive, which we had just invented. So it's as if we invented fire. And because of that, the gods came down and said, well, now you're one of us. And then, if you really want to go deep into the mythology of Star Trek, you can watch the series called Enterprise, which is like takes place in this transitional time between the old Earth in its backwardness and what it will become in the original series. I'm a big
no fan. There it is.
I'm like,
let's make these things blockbusters, or let's really do it, like let's challenge ourselves to think through these things. And it's so disappointing because there was like a brief moment where science fiction seemed to imagine just like, you have to write a backstory for it, but it was like, okay, where's the setting? Far future universe, of course. And you just like, without even realizing it, it's like, of course we'll have solved all of these things. Money will seem totally primitive. Like we intuit that in the far future, we recognize the way we live now is not going to go on forever. It will seem primitive. Had to have money, to have scarcity, to have exchange. All of these things will seem so silly. So we already imagine it. Now, if you see like Passengers, which I love this movie, by the way. I don't even care about a plot. You just put me on a spaceship where I can look around at like planets. I'm with you. I'm there. But this movie was so interesting because I remember my heart kind of sinking down into my stomach, where they were kind of like giving the backstory of why they're on this ship that's going into, they put them into some sort of cryogenic frozen state. So they travel for 180 years or something to another planet. And they're talking about why they're doing that. And it was to commodify it. And they're like, oh, did you know how much money they made off of the last planet? And it was so depressing because they were, we used to imagine that we would, by the time we were in these great big starships, we'd have left all that behind. Now we can't even imagine that. And in a way, it's very optimistic that we'll get into these kind of starships, and the main problems that will exist in our society will still be like that you have to have this wristband that only gets you shit coffee and cornflakes for the rest of your life when you wake up early. That's the big problem that we're imagining we're going to have when we're that far into the future. That's the limits of our optimism.
Right. Well, I think that we can see the limits of our optimism and imagination in this response to the UAP hearings, and also the way that we have understood the UFO story up to now. Did you see, or you probably haven't seen it yet, but because no one who actually works for Sublation watches my Critical Cuts videos in a timely manner, but I put out Critical Cuts called "What Will UFO Disclosure Reveal?"
I know, Doug, and I wanted to interview you about this.
Oh, you did watch it.
I did.
Okay.
It's in my plans for this episode.
Okay, good. We'll talk about it in the next part then. But one of the things I'll say about it is just that I think that first of all, what we have to accept is that the UFO story is a story about the U.S. state, and it is a story about what our relationship with one another and the outside world is going to be. And we should note that it is a story of U.S. conspiracy right now, and that the left's response to that it should be to demand transparency and to give everyday people access to this classified information. That's step one. Anything else, any other kind of demand is, I think, most likely going to be regressive. Any explanation of like, oh, Grush is a Mormon, or Americans are crazy, or anything like that, is a way to let the actual mediating power in society, that is the combination of nation states and capital, off the hook, and fail to demand power for everyday people and working class people to have some control over their own lives. And this is a kind of a fun example of how we misperceive the stakes, in the news or in our everyday lives all the time, and how we could conceivably not misperceive them. I mean, I think it's not that difficult to realize, and most people at least pay lip service to the idea that the main thing we should be calling for is the declassification of the documents and to allow Grush to speak openly to the public about what he thinks he knows. And if he has a list of sites where these craft are, Geraldo Rivera or whoever his equivalent is should be down there with cameras breaking open Al Capone's vault again. This time, though, it's the Area 51 vault. So anyway.
Right. Well, I want to go into this in a lot more detail, but we have got to go. We've given people much more than they should get for free. So we go.
All right. Yeah, we do. All right. So thanks for watching the first half. I will put up a link in the comments to this video to the Patreon. We'll start up in about 20 minutes, and
we will challenge ourselves to think through, what if it is aliens?
Yeah, here we go.